Ambassador Kalina Nix stood motionless before the viewport as Earth's space station Meridian grew larger against the star-speckled void. Her iridescent skin, with its subtle patterns of luminescence that shifted with her emotions, betrayed nothing of the anticipation churning within. As the first Eridani diplomat appointed to Earth, she carried not only her government's expectations, but centuries of her people's cautious approach to interspecies relations. "We're docking in 5 minutes, Ambassador," announced the pilot of the sleek diplomatic vessel. "Station Command has arranged a formal reception." Kalina inclined her head, the silver filaments woven through her obsidian hair catching the light. "Thank you, Taurus." Her voice carried the musical lilt characteristic of the Eridani, each word precisely enunciated. The Eridani Confederation had observed humanity for decades before initiating contact. Their assessment had been clear. Humans were brilliant but impulsive, innovative yet dangerously emotional. The High Council had selected Kalina for her exceptional control, her ability to maintain the calm rationality the Eridani prized above all else. "Remember the protocols," she reminded herself as the ship glided into the docking bay. Minimal physical contact, controlled expression, logical discourse only. The airlocks cycled open, revealing a delegation of uniformed Earth officials. At their center stood a tall man whose bearing immediately marked him as the leader. Unlike the stiff posture of those flanking him, he seemed relaxed, confident, qualities the Eridani associated with unpredictability. "Ambassador Nix." He stepped forward with a warm smile that creased the corners of his eyes. "I'm Captain Marcus Drake, your liaison during these negotiations. Welcome to Meridian." When he extended his hand, Kalina hesitated only momentarily before accepting it. The Eridani Diplomatic Corps had briefed her extensively on human greeting customs, but theory hadn't prepared her for the sensation of his skin against hers, warmer than an Eridani's and surprisingly soft despite its weathered appearance. "Captain Drake," she withdrew her hand perhaps too quickly, "the Confederation appreciates Earth's hospitality." His eyes, a striking blue reminiscent of the methane seas on Eridani Prime, studied her with undisguised curiosity. "The pleasure is ours, Ambassador. Your arrival marks a historic moment for both our peoples." The formal reception passed in a blur of introductions and ceremonial speeches. Kalina performed flawlessly, delivering her prepared remarks with the perfect balance of diplomatic cordiality and Eridani reserve. Yet throughout, she found her attention repeatedly drawn to Captain Drake, who watched her with an intensity that seemed to transcend professional interest. Later, in the private conference room where they would begin preliminary discussions, Kalina finally had the opportunity to observe him more closely. Unlike many humans who fidgeted constantly, he possessed a stillness that reminded her of home. But when he spoke, his voice carried a rich vitality that no Eridani would permit themselves. "I hope our accommodations meet your needs," he said, gesturing to the quarters they had modified based on Eridani physiological requirements. "Our xenobiologists worked overtime to get everything right." "They have succeeded admirably," she replied, nodding with surprise that her skin luminescence had brightened slightly, a response she hadn't consciously permitted. Drake noticed it too, his gaze lingering on the patterns swirling across her exposed forearms. "Fascinating," he murmured, then caught himself. "Forgive me, I was told the Eridani consider personal observations impolite." "We do," she confirmed, but added, "However, I understand curiosity is highly valued in human culture. Your scientific advancements stem from it." A smile played at the corners of his mouth. "And what does Eridani culture value most, Ambassador?" The question was deceptively simple, yet Kalina recognized it as probing deeper than protocol dictated for a first meeting. Still, she found herself wanting to answer. "Control," she said. "We believe true wisdom comes from mastering oneself before attempting to understand others." Drake leaned forward slightly. "And what do the Eridani think of us humans? Officially, I mean." The intensity of his gaze made her pause. There was the diplomatic answer, carefully crafted by her superiors. Then there was the truth, including the warnings she'd received about human men in particular, their unpredictable emotions, their tendency to pursue what they desired regardless of consequences. "Our assessment notes your species' remarkable adaptability," she began carefully. "Your creativity, your resilience." "But," he prompted, clearly sensing her omission. Against her better judgment, Kalina leaned slightly closer. Our elders caution that humans are disruptive. Your emotions overrule your logic in ways that can be problematic for species like mine. Problematic, his voice lowered to match hers. How so? The luminescence beneath her skin pulsed once, unbidden. Because you make us question certainties we've held for millennia. Their eyes locked, and in that moment, Kalina knew she had already strayed from the strict protocols that had guided her training. Something about Marcus Drake drew her toward dangerous territory, a gravity as real and insistent as that which held the station in orbit. And that was precisely why the elders had warned her about humans. The weeks following Kalina's arrival on Meridian unfolded in a rhythm of formal negotiations and carefully orchestrated cultural exchanges. Trade agreements, scientific collaboration protocols, and territorial boundaries dominated the daylight discussions. But in the artificial twilight of the station's cycle, it was the unofficial exchanges that occupied Kalina's thoughts. The Eridani Gardens are particularly impressive, Marcus remarked as they walked through Meridian's botanical section, where Earth scientists had painstakingly recreated Eridani flora. Though I suspect they pale in comparison to the real thing. Kalina brushed her fingers over a luminous frond. You've captured their form perfectly, she admitted, but not their essence. On Eridani Prime, these plants communicate through light patterns, conversations too subtle for most species to detect. Like your skin, Marcus observed, then quickly added, I apologize if that's too personal. The patterns beneath Kalina's skin rippled briefly. Your observation is correct. Our bioluminescence evolved alongside our flora. She hesitated, then shared something not included in the official briefings. It's why Eridani rarely lie. Our bodies betray our true emotions. Marcus stopped walking. That must make diplomacy challenging. It's why we value control so highly. Their eyes met again, and Kalina felt that now familiar flutter of disruption. Emotional transparency can be dangerous in delicate negotiations. Or liberating, he countered. Humans spend lifetimes learning to read each other's hidden signals. Sometimes I think we overcomplicate things. An alert chimed on Marcus's communication device, interrupting their exchange. His expression shifted instantly from relaxed to alert. We have a situation in Docking Bay 3. A freighter has reported potential containment failure in their cryogenic storage. He was already moving. Protocol requires immediate evacuation of that section. The Tellurian delegation's quarters are in that section, Kalina noted, matching his stride. They're particularly vulnerable to temperature fluctuations. Damn, Marcus muttered. Engineering estimates at least 30 minutes before they can secure the leak. Without hesitation, Kalina activated her own communication device. I can offer temporary sanctuary in the Eridani diplomatic wing. Our environmental systems can accommodate Tellurian physiology. The crisis response moved with efficiency that impressed even Kalina's Eridani sensibilities. Within hours, the situation was contained, with no casualties and minimal disruption to station operations. But the collaborative problem-solving had shifted something between her and Marcus. Professional respect had deepened into something that felt dangerously like admiration. Later, as they shared a quiet moment in the observation lounge, watching emergency teams complete their work, Marcus broke the comfortable silence. You were remarkable today, he said, his voice carrying an unexpected warmth. Not every diplomat would extend their protected space to a species they're still in negotiations with. It was logical, she replied, though the subtle brightening of her skin betrayed a more complex emotion. The success of the Meridian project requires all delegations to thrive. Marcus smiled slightly. Logic alone doesn't account for how quickly you acted. There's compassion there, too. The Eridani aren't without emotion, Captain, she corrected gently. We simply believe emotions should serve wisdom rather than override it. And what does your wisdom tell you about our work together so far? His question seemed innocent, but his eyes held that intensity again, the one that made her conscious of every molecule of air between them. That humans are more complex than our studies suggested. She found herself stepping closer. Your unpredictability isn't always a liability. High praise coming from you? His voice had dropped to that lower register that seemed to resonate directly with her pulse. There's something else our elders warned about, she admitted, aware she was venturing into territory far beyond diplomatic protocol. They said human men possess a quality that's particularly disorienting for Eridani women. Marcus's breath caught audibly. What quality is that? Presence, she said softly. You exist so fully in each moment, it's distracting. The space between them seemed charged with potential energy. Marcus lifted his hand slowly, giving her time to retreat, and gently touched the back of her wrist where the luminescence pulsed more rapidly. Is that what's happening now? He asked. Distraction. Before she could answer, the door to the observation lounge slid open. Ambassador Joran, her Eridani colleague, stood frozen in the entrance, his own skin patterns displaying unmistakable alarm as he observed their proximity. Ambassador Nix, he said stiffly, the High Council has requested an immediate private communication. Kalina stepped back from Marcus, her diplomatic training reasserting itself. Of course, Captain Drake and I were just reviewing today's security response. Joran's expression made it clear he wasn't deceived, but he merely inclined his head. The Council awaits. As she followed Joran from the lounge, Kalina caught Marcus's gaze one last time. The concern in his eyes mirrored her own growing realization. What was developing between them wouldn't stay private for long, and when it became known, the consequences would extend far beyond personal repercussions. For the first time in her distinguished career, Ambassador Kalina Nix feared she might not be able to control what came next. Your conduct is endangering the entire diplomatic mission, Ambassador Nix. High Counselor Varys's hologram dominated the secure communication chamber, her disapproval evident in both her tone and the severe patterns cascading across her translucent skin. Behind her, other council members watched in silent judgment. Kalina maintained her posture of formal respect despite the churning sensation in her chest. I've adhered to all official protocols, Counselor. Your body tells a different story. Varys's gaze was piercing even across light years. We've received Ambassador Joran's report. Your interactions with the human captain exceed professional requirements. Captain Drake and I have established an effective working relationship, Kalina countered carefully. The recent Tellurian crisis was handled appropriately, Varys interrupted, but what followed was not. You are not there to form personal attachments, Ambassador. You are there to secure the Confederation's interests. The words stung with their accuracy. Kalina had replayed that moment in the observation lounge countless times since it happened. The almost touch, the confession, the interrupted possibility. The mission remains my priority, she assured the council, though her luminescence flickered slightly, betraying her conflict. Varys's expression softened marginally. Kalina, you were selected for your exceptional control. We understand the unique challenge that humans present to our physiological responses. Their emotional intensity can be temporarily compelling, but it is ultimately incompatible with our ways. With respect, Counselor, perhaps our understanding of humans requires revision. The words left her mouth before she could reconsider them. A shocked silence followed. Even questioning the Confederation's assessments was unusual for a diplomat. You have 2 cycles to correct this situation, Varys finally said. Distance yourself from the human, focus on the trade agreements. If your judgment remains compromised, we will have no choice but to recall you. After the communication ended, Kalina remained in the chamber, her reflection shimmering in the polished surfaces surrounding her. The patterns across her skin revealed what she was only beginning to acknowledge to herself. Something beyond diplomatic interest had awakened in her, something that centuries of Eridani conditioning had not prepared her to resist. Over the following days, she implemented the Council's directive with methodical precision. Meetings with Marcus were conducted in group settings. Personal conversations were redirected to official matters. When his gaze sought hers across conference tables, she maintained the neutral expression that had once come so naturally to her. Marcus noticed the change immediately, but waited until the 3rd day to confront her, catching her alone as she exited the diplomatic archives. Have I offended you somehow, Ambassador? His voice carried none of the warmth that had become customary between them. Not at all, Captain. She kept walking, forcing him to fall into step beside her. I've simply been focusing on our priority negotiations. That's not what this is about. He moved in front of her, halting her progress down the corridor. Something changed after Joran interrupted us. The directness of humans, both frustrating and oddly compelling. My superiors have expressed concerns about our professional boundaries. Understanding dawned in his eyes. They're worried about us. There is no us, Captain, she said, the carefully chosen words at odds with the quickened pulse of light beneath her skin. There cannot be. For a moment, hurt flashed across his features. Then his expression shifted to something more complex, determination mixed with resignation. I understand protocol, Ambassador, but I also understand what I felt in that room and what your skin is telling me right now. My physiology is not the issue, she insisted, though they both knew otherwise. Then what is? His voice had lowered, creating an intimacy in the public corridor that made her acutely aware of passing crew members' curious glances. The Eridani value stability, Captain, predictability. Humans represent the opposite. And is that really so terrible? He stepped closer, not touching her, but creating a proximity that felt equally dangerous. Maybe what both our species need is a little disruption of the established order. The diplomatic reception that evening marked the halfway point of the negotiations. Representatives from 12 species mingled in Meridian's grand observation deck, the vast panorama of stars creating a backdrop of breathtaking beauty. Kalina performed her duties with practiced precision, moving from one delegation to another, building the alliances that would strengthen the Confederation's position. She was speaking with the Tellurian ambassador when she sensed Marcus enter the room. Though she didn't turn, her awareness of him was immediate and unsettling. When he eventually approached her group, she acknowledged him with the same formal nod she offered all human officials. The Tellurians were just expressing their gratitude for the Eridani's assistance during the containment incident, she explained, maintaining the professional distance she'd established. Ambassador Nix's quick thinking prevented a diplomatic incident, Marcus agreed, his tone equally formal though his eyes held a question. If you'll excuse us, Ambassador Tilar, I need to borrow Ambassador Nix for a matter regarding the Proxima Treaty Clause. The Tellurian nodded their tentacled head in acquiescence, and before Kalina could object, Marcus had guided her toward a less crowded section of the observation deck. There is no issue with the Proxima Clause, she noted once they were relative privacy. No, but it was the only way I could think to speak with you privately, he studied her face. You've been avoiding me. As instructed by my government, she acknowledged, seeing no point in denial. And is that what you want? The directness of the question caught her off guard. My personal preferences are irrelevant to my mission. They're not irrelevant to me. His voice carried a rawness she hadn't heard before. Kalina, I've served in diplomatic posts across 3 sectors. I've never met anyone like you, Eridani or human. What's happening between us matters. The use of her personal name, not her title, sent a visible wave of luminescence across her skin. Marcus. The informality felt both forbidden and right. The Council has threatened to recall me if I continue to engage with you personally. Understanding darkened his features. They're afraid. They're cautious, she corrected. Human-Eridani relations are still fragile. This isn't about diplomacy, he said, daring to touch her wrist where the light pulsed strongest. They're afraid of what we represent, the possibility that their carefully constructed cultural barriers might not be as necessary as they believe. His touch sent cascades of light racing beneath her skin, visible even through the formal attire of her position. The sensation was intoxicating, terrifying in its intensity. I should return to the reception, she whispered, but made no move to leave. Come with me first, he urged, just for a moment. Against every protocol, every warning, she followed him to a small anteroom adjoining the main observation deck, Meridian's stellar cartography lab, currently deserted during the reception. Stars and planetary systems swirled around them in holographic display, bathing them in shimmering light. I requested reassignment this morning, Marcus said once the door had closed behind them. My superiors refused. Shock rippled across her skin. You tried to leave the negotiation team. To protect your position, he explained. I thought if I removed myself. No, the force of her response surprised them both. That is not the solution. He stepped closer, the holographic stars seeming to swirl around him. Then what is? Because I can't keep pretending I don't feel what I feel when I'm with you. The words she had been suppressing for weeks finally emerged. Nor can I. The admission hung between them, as tangible as the simulated stars surrounding them. Marcus reached out slowly, giving her time to retreat, and traced the luminescent patterns that now flowed freely across her exposed skin. The touch was electric, sending waves of sensation through her that no Eridani would ever permit themselves to display so openly. "Your people can see your emotions," he murmured. "What would they read in these patterns right now?" "Desire," she whispered, abandoning diplomacy for honesty. "Confusion, fear." His hand moved to cup her face, thumb brushing across her cheekbone where the patterns glowed most intensely. "And if I kissed you?" Her respiratory rate increased, visible in the quickened pulse of light beneath her skin. "The patterns would be unprecedented." His smile was gentle, understanding the admission for what it was, that no Eridani had experienced or displayed what she was feeling now. "May I?" Instead of answering, Kalina closed the distance between them herself, pressing her lips to his in a gesture that was human in origin but transcended species in its meaning. The contact sent cascades of light racing across her skin, patterns so brilliant and complex that the holographic stars around them seemed to dim in comparison. For a moment, there were no diplomatic protocols, no disapproving councils, no incompatible cultures. Only the discovery of something neither of their species had anticipated when they first reached across the stars toward one another. The sound of the door sliding open broke them apart. Kalina turned, already knowing what she would see. Ambassador Joran, his skin patterns displaying shock and dismay, a small recording device clutched in his hand. "The Council will receive this transmission within the hour," he said, his voice cold with disapproval. "You have violated every principle of Eridani diplomatic conduct, Ambassador Nix." As Joran departed, Kalina and Marcus remained motionless among the swirling stars, both understanding that their private exploration had just become a very public diplomatic incident. The footage has already circulated among 6 delegations. Admiral Helena Reeves paced the length of her office, her weathered face set in lines of controlled fury. "Do you have any idea what you've done, Captain?" Marcus stood at attention, his military bearing impeccable despite the storm raging around him. "I take full responsibility for my actions, Admiral." "Your actions?" She turned to face him, eyes narrowed. "This isn't about a personal indiscretion. This is about potentially setting back human-Eridani relations by decades." The Admiral's words stung, but they weren't unexpected. In the 24 hours since Joran had discovered them in the cartography lab, Marcus had imagined this conversation 100 different ways. None of them ended well. "The Eridani High Council has formally requested your removal from the negotiation team," Admiral Reeves continued, sliding a data tablet across her desk. "They've also recalled Ambassador Nix, effective immediately." A cold weight settled in Marcus's chest. "Recalled her for one moment of..." "For what they're calling diplomatic contamination," the Admiral cut in sharply. "Their communique suggests that prolonged exposure to human emotionality has compromised her judgment." Anger flared within him. "That's absurd. Ambassador Nix is one of the most composed, rational diplomats I've ever worked with." "And yet," Admiral Reeves said, her voice dangerously quiet, "there's footage of her glowing like a supernova while kissing you in a restricted access area during an official reception." Marcus had no counter for that. The image was seared into his memory, Kalina's skin illuminated with patterns more complex and beautiful than any he'd seen, her usual restraint transformed into something transcendent. He couldn't bring himself to regret it even now. "The Tellurian delegation is threatening to withdraw from the coalition entirely," the Admiral continued. "They've cited concerns about emotional contamination affecting the objectivity of the proceedings." "The Tellurians," Marcus frowned, "they weren't even present when..." "Ambassador Joran shared the footage with them specifically," she explained grimly. "Apparently, the Tellurians have their own taboos regarding interspecies relationships. He knew exactly how they would react." Strategic sabotage. Marcus had suspected Joran resented Kalina's appointment as lead negotiator, but this level of calculated damage was beyond what he'd imagined. "Where is she now?" he asked, dreading the answer. "Under what amounts to house arrest in the Eridani diplomatic wing," the Admiral replied, her expression softening slightly. "Their transport arrives in 6 hours." 6 hours, the knowledge hit him like a physical blow. I need to see her. Absolutely not. Admiral Reeves's voice hardened again. You're confined to quarters pending reassignment. Security will escort you there now. As Marcus turned to leave, the Admiral added, This isn't just about you and her, Drake. The trade routes we're negotiating affect billions of lives across 12 systems. Remember that before you do anything else impulsive. The hours that followed were among the longest of Marcus's life. Confined to his quarters, he paced the limited space like a caged animal, his mind racing through scenarios, each more desperate than the last. The stakes were impossibly high, not just for him and Kalina, but for the delicate web of interstellar relationships that had taken decades to build. When his door chime sounded 3 hours later, he expected security personnel come to escort him to a disciplinary hearing. Instead, Dr. Alara Voss, Meridian's chief xenobiologist and one of the few people on the station he considered a friend, stood in the corridor. I have 5 minutes before security realizes I've bypassed the lockdown on your quarters, she said without preamble, stepping inside. And I'm probably throwing away my career by being here, so listen carefully. What's happening? He asked, hope and dread mingling in his chest. The situation has escalated beyond anyone's expectations, Alara explained, her voice low and urgent. 3 more delegations have aligned with the Tellurians, calling for a complete restructuring of the negotiation teams. The Eridani are threatening to withdraw from the treaty entirely. Because of what happened between Kalina and me. That was the catalyst, but this goes deeper. She handed him a data chip. The Eridani have been studying human emotional responses since first contact. They're fascinated by us and terrified. Your relationship with Ambassador Nix represents their worst fear, that exposure to human emotions might be contagious. The realization struck him. They're not angry because she broke protocol. They're afraid because she felt something they don't understand. Precisely, Alara nodded. And now they're using this incident to justify closing borders that were just beginning to open. How do you know all this? A sad smile crossed her features. Because I've been working with a junior member of the Eridani science team, someone who believes their policy of emotional suppression has stunted their cultural evolution. I need to talk to Kalina, Marcus insisted. There has to be a way to fix this. That's why I'm here. Alara glanced nervously at the door. Ambassador Nix requested asylum an hour ago. The words took a moment to register. Asylum from her own government. She's arguing that forced recall over an emotional response violates her rights under the Interspecies Autonomy Charter. Alara's eyes gleamed with unexpected hope. It's unprecedented but technically valid. Admiral Reeves has granted a temporary stay pending review. For the first time in hours, Marcus felt something other than despair. Where is she now? In the neutral diplomatic chamber, presenting her case to representatives from the Coalition Council. Alara checked her communication device. The hearing starts in 20 minutes. If you're going to do something, it needs to be now. I'm under house arrest, he reminded her, frustration evident in his voice. Yes, about that. She produced a security override card. I may have convinced Dr. Nevin that we need your biometric data for important research on human Eridani physiological compatibility. Marcus stared at her in disbelief. You're risking everything to help us. Why? Because in 15 years of studying interspecies relations, I've never seen anything like what's happening between you two. Her expression grew serious. And because isolation and emotional suppression are not the path to a peaceful galaxy. What you and Ambassador Nix have discovered might be more important than you realize. 20 minutes later, Marcus stood outside the neutral diplomatic chamber, heart pounding. Security would discover his absence soon if they hadn't already. The door was sealed, the hearing in progress. Through the observation panel, he could see Kalina standing before the assembled representatives, her posture perfect but her skin pulsing with undisguised emotion as she addressed them. Even from a distance, she was magnificent, all pretense of Eridani reserve abandoned as she spoke with a passion that seemed to captivate the diverse gathering of species. Ambassador Joran sat apart from her, his own skin patterns conveying rigid disapproval. Marcus's security clearance wouldn't grant him access, but the service entrance Dr. Voss had mentioned might. He made his way through the maintenance corridors, counting on the chaos of the diplomatic crisis to have left secondary systems with minimal supervision. The gamble paid off. The service door to the chamber was guarded by a single security officer, Ensign Mara Kiv, whom Marcus had once helped during a difficult personal situation. "Captain Drake," she said, surprise evident in her voice, "you're supposed to be confined to quarters, I know." He met her gaze directly. "Ensign, what's happening in there will determine the future of relations between 12 species. I need to be part of it." She hesitated, conflict clear in her expression. "They'll court-martial me." "Probably," he agreed honestly, "but some things are worth the risk." After a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, she stepped aside. "You have 3 minutes before I report an anomaly in the security system that I need to investigate." "Thank you," he said simply, knowing no other words could convey his gratitude. As he slipped into the chamber through the service entrance, Kalina's voice reached him, clear and resonant. "Not asking you to rewrite our cultural norms," she was saying. "I am asking you to recognize that exploration of space, of knowledge, and yes, of emotion, is what brought each of our species to this point of potential alliance." The chamber was arranged in concentric circles, with Kalina at the center and representatives from each delegation seated in tiered rows around her. Marcus remained in the shadows of the service area, unnoticed for the moment. "The Eridani have observed humans for generations," she continued. "We've cataloged your emotional responses, categorized your behavioral patterns, all while maintaining what we believed was a safe distance from your influence. But in doing so, we failed to understand the most fundamental truth about your species, that your emotions are not weaknesses to be controlled, but catalysts for your greatest strengths." Ambassador Joran rose from his seat. "This is precisely the evidence of contamination we have warned about," he declared. "Ambassador Nix now advocates for human emotionality after weeks of exposure to their influence. Her judgment is irreparably compromised." "My judgment is clearer than it has ever been," Kalina countered, her skin illuminating with patterns so complex that several delegates leaned forward in fascination. "For centuries, the Eridani have suppressed our emotional responses in the name of logic and control. But what I have discovered through my work with Captain Drake is that emotion and reason need not be adversaries." The Tellurian representative's translation device emitted a series of clicks before rendering their words. "How can we trust negotiations led by diplomats who have formed inappropriate personal attachments?" "Perhaps," Marcus said, stepping forward from the shadows, "the question should be, how can we trust negotiations conducted without any personal understanding between species?" A ripple of surprise moved through the chamber. Admiral Reeves, seated among the human delegation, closed her eyes briefly in what appeared to be either resignation or prayer. Kalina's luminescence flared in response to his presence, but her voice remained steady. "Captain Drake raises a valid point. True diplomacy requires more than formal protocols. It requires genuine understanding." Marcus moved to stand beside her at the center of the chamber, ignoring the security personnel who had begun to move toward him at Admiral Reeves's signal. "What Ambassador Nix and I have discovered isn't a diplomatic incident," he addressed the assembly. "It's a diplomatic opportunity. For the first time, we have the chance to build relations between our species based on genuine connection rather than carefully maintained distance." The Eridani Council representative, attending via hologram, spoke for the first time. "Captain Drake, your interference in this hearing is inappropriate. Ambassador Nix is being recalled for rehabilitation and—" "Rehabilitation," Marcus couldn't keep the anger from his voice. "For experiencing emotions you find inconvenient. For failing to maintain the control that defines our species," the council representative corrected coldly. "With respect," Kalina interjected, her gaze sweeping the assembled delegates, "perhaps what defines a species should not be its limitations, but its capacity for growth." The chamber fell silent. Even Ambassador Joran seemed momentarily at a loss for words. It was the Ashari representative, from a species known for their philosophical approach to interstellar relations, who broke the silence. "I am curious," they said, their melodic voice carrying through the chamber. "What exactly are you proposing, Ambassador Nix?" Kalina and Marcus exchanged a glance, something passing between them that needed no words. "We propose," Kalina said, her voice strong and clear, "that instead of treating what has developed between Captain Drake and myself as a violation of protocol, the Council consider it as a case study in human-Eridani relations. A controlled experiment, Marcus added, understanding her direction immediately, with proper oversight and documentation. You suggest we sanction this relationship as a diplomatic exercise. The Eridani Council representative's tone made their skepticism clear. I suggest, Kalina replied, her luminescence steady and bright, that true understanding between species cannot be achieved through observation alone. It requires participation, experience, even risk. For a tense moment, no one spoke. Then Admiral Reeves rose from her seat. The human delegation is willing to consider Ambassador Nix's proposal, provided appropriate boundaries and oversight are established. The Tellurian representatives' appendages rippled in what their species recognized as thoughtful consideration. The scientific potential is intriguing. One by one, the representatives began to engage with the idea, their initial shock giving way to cautious curiosity. Even Ambassador Joran, though clearly displeased, offered a grudging acknowledgement that the proposal might have merit as a controlled cultural exchange. As the discussion evolved around them, Marcus turned to Kalina, keeping his voice low. Are you certain about this? They'll be watching our every move, analyzing every interaction. The patterns across her skin formed shapes he was beginning to recognize as joy mixed with determination. We've already crossed the line, Marcus. Now we have the chance to redraw it, not just for ourselves, but for both our species. In the center of the diplomatic chamber, surrounded by representatives of 12 worlds, they stood together, not touching, but connected by something that transcended physical contact. The fate of their unusual proposal remained uncertain, but for the first time since Joran had discovered them in the cartography lab, there was hope that what had begun as a forbidden attraction might become something revolutionary. And as the council continued its deliberations, the patterns of light beneath Kalina's skin told a story that everyone in the chamber could read, one of courage, possibility, and the transformative power of connection across the stars. 3 months after what station personnel had begun calling the cartography incident, Kalina stood before the viewport in her quarters, watching a Tellurian trade vessel depart. The negotiations that had nearly collapsed in scandal had instead concluded with the most comprehensive interspecies agreement in galactic history, the Meridian Accords. Contemplating your diplomatic triumph? Marcus asked, entering with 2 steaming cups of the herbal blend they had created together, a fusion of Earth botanicals and Eridani flora that symbolized their ongoing experiment in harmonizing different worlds. Contemplating change, she replied, accepting the cup. The warmth against her palms triggered gentle waves of luminescence, no longer something she attempted to suppress when they were alone. The first joint human Eridani research colony launches next week. Thanks to your proposal, pride colored his voice as he joined her at the viewport. Kalina smiled. Our proposal. The interspecies study that had begun as a desperate gambit to prevent her recall had evolved into something far more profound than either of them had anticipated. Under the watchful eyes of xenobiologists, cultural anthropologists, and diplomatic observers, their relationship had become a template for a new kind of interspecies engagement, one based on mutual exploration rather than cautious distance. The High Council's latest communication arrived this morning, she said, setting her cup down on the viewport ledge. They're still processing the data from our weekly reports. Marcus laughed softly. I imagine processing is diplomatic speak for utterly confounded. They've never encountered an Eridani who voluntarily chose to experience the full spectrum of emotion, she acknowledged. The physiological readings alone have caused something of a scientific revolution back home. What neither of them had predicted was how quickly other Eridani would express interest in the findings. A small but growing movement had begun among younger members of her species, those who questioned the rigid emotional suppression that had defined their culture for millennia. And how are you processing it all? Marcus asked, the question gentle but direct in that uniquely human way she had come to cherish. Kalina considered this. In the months since their first kiss, she had experienced joy so intense it had literally illuminated an entire room. She had known frustration that threatened to shatter her legendary control, grief that hollowed her when a joint expedition was lost, and desire that transformed her bioluminescence into patterns previously undocumented in Eridani physiology. I am more, she said finally, More alive, more aware, more myself. Marcus set his cup beside hers and brushed his fingers across the back of her hand, a simple gesture that still sent cascades of light dancing beneath her skin. Any regrets? None, she said with a certainty that required no diplomatic consideration. Though I confess I occasionally miss privacy, the constant observation is challenging. They both glanced toward the corner of her quarters, where environmental sensors monitored their interactions as part of the official study. The scientific oversight had been the compromise that allowed their relationship to continue. Every conversation, every physiological response, every cultural exchange carefully documented for analysis. Dr. Voss mentioned they've collected enough baseline data, Marcus said. She's recommending reduced monitoring protocols going forward. Kalina raised an eyebrow, a human gesture she had adopted. Truly. She made a compelling case that natural development requires some degree of privacy. His smile held a hint of mischief. Apparently, even scientists recognize that constant observation affects the experiment. The prospect of greater privacy sent a visible ripple of anticipation across Kalina's skin. Their physical relationship had progressed slowly, each new intimacy carefully negotiated between cultural boundaries and personal desire. The freedom to explore without documentation would be liberating. The Ashari representative has requested permission to adapt our protocol for their own species, she told him, changing the subject before her luminescence betrayed the direction of her thoughts. It seems we've started something of a diplomatic revolution. The Horizon Protocol, Marcus nodded. The name they had given their approach had begun to spread throughout diplomatic circles, a methodology that encouraged genuine cultural exchange and personal connection rather than formal distance. A communication alert chimed from Kalina's console. Admiral Reeves, she noted, checking the identifier. Shall we? Together they moved to the small conference area of her quarters. The Admiral's hologram materialized above the table, her expression uncharacteristically pleased. Ambassador, Captain, she greeted them. I've just received word from Earth Central Command. They've approved the expansion of the Horizon Protocol to include 5 additional species. You'll both be heading the training program. Kalina and Marcus exchanged a glance of shared satisfaction. What had begun as a scandal was becoming a model. There's more, the Admiral continued. The Eridani High Council has officially requested that you remain as their permanent representative, Ambassador Nix. It seems your unorthodox approach has proven more effective than traditional diplomacy. A complex mixture of vindication and pride moved through Kalina, visible in the intricate patterns that now flowed freely across her skin. I am honored to accept, Admiral. After the communication ended, Marcus turned to her. Permanent assignment, he said, taking her hands in his. That calls for celebration. Indeed, she stepped closer, the luminescence beneath her skin brightening in response to his proximity. I believe I've discovered another human custom I wish to explore more fully. Oh, his voice held that lower register that still sent pleasant vibrations through her nervous system. And what custom is that? Kalina reached up and deactivated the environmental sensors with a deliberate gesture. For the first time since their relationship had become an official diplomatic study, they were truly alone. No observers, no data collection, no reports to file. The custom, she said, moving into his arms, of privacy. As his lips met hers, Kalina's luminescence responded with patterns so complex and beautiful they would have fascinated the scientists, had they been watching. But this moment belonged only to them, an ambassador who had discovered emotion and a captain who had found understanding, pioneers on the frontier of what was possible when different worlds truly connected. In the darkened room, illuminated only by the stars outside and the glow of Kalina's skin, they wrote their own protocol, one based not on careful distance, but on the revolutionary power of intimacy across the boundaries of worlds.